academic.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's my honor and my pleasure to welcome each of you here this morning. And we want to acknowledge and thank Mayor Mario Bowser, the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, and the Department of Housing and Community Development in highlighting the creation of this Black Homeownership Strike Force and this kickoff. I also want to acknowledge a couple of my colleagues here at Howard University with the Urban Institute, and also our Center of Excellence in Housing and Urban Research and Policy led by Professor Haydar Kerbin. Certainly, home ownership is a critical issue to each of us, not only in terms of affordable housing, but also in relation to the creation of wealth that can be transferred across generations that are really critical issues to our communities. Howard, as an institution, has been in the district since 1867 for over 154 years. And we would say that social justice is in our DNA. And so issues that affect our community, issues that affect people of color are certainly central to our mission and central to the things that we want to help to support as the district continues to move forward. So again, I want to welcome each of you here. We certainly look forward to continuing to partner and collaborate with the district. And again, want to acknowledge and thank my colleagues who will continue to be a critical part of this effort. Thank you.
So we want to thank Howard University for hosting us in this beautiful building, by the way. And so we will get started. I also want to say that in terms of, let's start by saying White. I'm Tim White. I'm the Executive Director of Equitable Development in the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development.
I am the Director of Housing Policy and Programs at the Office of Development, which we're going to call DEMPED because that's a mouthful to say.
And make sure so in terms of engagement throughout this process, we want to make sure you all are aware that we need you to register at blackhome.dc.gov. Please register. That will allow for you all to speak as well as to send in your comments, and we want to make sure we get all of the questions answered. Please continue to go to that page to get information about what's going on. There's a form on that site that will allow for the community throughout this process to give us constant feedback. And so we want to make sure that we are hearing from you. And as we do more community engagement efforts, your contact information that you submit as a part of the registration will allow for us to stay in contact with you to know what's going on. And so we look forward to hearing from you, hearing your thoughts, and figuring out how Strike Force can incorporate that in what we do. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
So for those who are watching on channel 16, we want to make sure we hear from you as well. You can submit comments by registering on the link that is on that website for the morning session. That will allow you to submit questions that could be that we will reference at the end of the morning. And so we have a great morning planned for all of you. And while we just get our Zoom set up real quick, we will be trying to, this conversation was really intended to be an opportunity to level set our expectations of what this initiative is about, to make sure that we're all coming at it thinking about the same issues. And so we will be first kicking off with a video called Segregated by Design. Some of you have seen it before, but hopefully you're going to get to see it again with fresh eyes. That is going to kind of lay out the national issues before us. And then from there, we are going to have Dr. Vanessa Perry speak on the trends and how that impacts our conversation here locally. And we will end with a panel discussion with a robust set of our colleagues on the issues and trends that we need to be thinking about as the Black Homeownership Strike Force kicks off. And so with that, I am going to get started here.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aim to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all work together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African-American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Right. Okay, can I just see a show of hands if this is the first time you've ever seen that video? That's great. And for those who've seen it before, hopefully it's a reminder of why we're here today. With that, I'm going to introduce the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development, and then to say DEPA, John Papatukio, to give us some opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Well, thank you for being here today. We've got a beautiful day for it. Who wants to be out in that rain? And really, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for being. I want you to take a moment right now. I know a lot of people have known that out. Write down the one feeling that you're looking for. Take a moment. Write down the feeling that you're looking for. And the reason I'm asking you to do that is because that's what I want to look at to help carry you through the summer. We'll be meeting in person, we'll be meeting virtually, we'll be asking you for a lot, we'll be using a lot of compliances. We know you all have other responsibilities, but look at that in motion and know that the work that you're doing is so important. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience, and I'll go back to actually further than my own personal experience. But for my family, my grandfather bought his first home in 1941. My father was raised in that house, and I was raised in that house as well. My siblings and I, along with 4 children, each of us now live in a home that we own after going to college, based on the savings that our parents were able to make by being homeowners of a home that was passed down generation. So when you think about where I stand and where we all stand, what we need to do is make sure that we advance the opportunity for homeownership, so that we create that same trajectory for our families here in the state. So think about how much I stand here with the advantage of having a family that owned a home since 1941, that passes through a generation, and then to be able to know that my siblings then were able to leverage that advantage of being homeowners themselves. That's what we have to create. And we have a short amount of time to do it, right? We have a short amount of time. So what we like to say is that the mayor sets the vision. That it's our job to find people, policies, and processes, to actually make sure that we can advance that vision. And so one of the tasks for this strike force is to actually make sure that we set a goal by 2030 for Black homeowners, net new Black homeowners in the District of Columbia, net new Black homeowners. We want to make sure that Black homeowners who own it now can keep their homes, and we want to add to that by 2030. So why is 2030 important? Anybody want to guess? 2030. Census. So that's the next census, right? So we want to see a change between the 2020 number and the 2030. What we'll do today and in the sessions afterwards, we'll talk about where we are in terms of data. So let me give you a couple of data points right now. Does anyone know the average price of a home? Sorry, my government partner is not allowed to answer. Does anybody know the average price of a home? Let's just go multifamily. So for layman's terms, a condo in the District of Columbia, the average price. Collins. Yeah.
I think it's 400.
400. Okay. Average.
So that's some that was 600,000. So is that it?
Now those are single family homes, right? So these are conduit multifamily. So 400 was a guess, and that's a good guess, but it's a little bit low.
Yes.
So the average is actually about $580,000.
Yeah.
Right? Now, let's go to the example you use.
Yeah.
And Reverend Hagler got a little bit of attention on social media for this one.
Yeah, and me too.
It's okay, but here's what I want everybody to know.
It's too much.
That's why we have this meeting. That's why you all are doing this work this summer. We know that we stand in a place where we have to actually be intentional about the people, policies, and procedures we put forth to advance Black homeownership, right?
That's fine.
So what Reverend Hagler said, I associate myself with fully. Mayor Bowser does as well, because that's the challenge that we're trying to tackle. So for single family homes, the average price in the District of Columbia, RV built on, what's your guess? 900.
Average.
Average.
Or is that average?
Single family.
Single thing?
Single family, so not whether it's hash or not. So it's $1,080,000, right? So now that is a lot to dig in, right? When you think about it and the work that we have to do with that. So why did Mayor Bowser change?
What's the median?
Let me make sure, let me get all the data. That's what this is all about. That's what this is all about, you're right. So, and we'll go through that, but that's one of the reasons why the mayor actually made an adjustment to HVAC this year, along with the leadership of Councilmember Bonds, to make sure that HVAC allowed for more buying power from our residents. So it was previously, the cap was $80,000, and now it's $202,000 in order to keep up with that rise in the price of housing. So that's one measure, but that's clearly, it's not enough, right? So that's why we're convening the strike force. You also, in addition to setting the goal, to giving us recommendations on people, policies, procedures to get that vision of more Black ownership. You also have to set a goal for 2030, right? You have to set that goal. And then the other thing is you have one tool at your disposal that is yours to figure out what we do with it, right? And it'll take some work from us to actually execute it. But we want a recommendation on how to utilize the Black Homeownership Strike Force as a $10 million strike to Black Homeownership fund associated with it. So how would you use that seed investment of $10 million? Now, I don't want you to throw out answers today. I want you to think that through, and that's what the recommendations for the mayor should include. So charting a course that we set a goal for 2030, figuring out the people policies and the processes to make sure that we hit that goal, and then how to utilize the $10 million fund that is the seed fund of the Black Homeownership Fund. So that's what you're set out to do. Any questions for me?
Can you ask for more money? That's not.
I imagine that there's going to be, and that question's been asked, I've seen it asked as well. I imagine that is not the only investment that would be made. However, I don't think it's, so what happens, and the reason why we set this up this timeline is what happens for us on the executive side in November is usually when we start and looking at my federal, my government partners, looking at my government partners, because they know they start this process. In October and November is when we start making our budget recommendations to the mayor. So that actually starts. It gets presented to the council in March or so. Yeah, March. So what we do is over that couple months. So the reason why this strike force is moving over the summer with a deadline to be done by the end of September, beginning of October, is to make sure that the agencies that are with you, that are meeting with you, have your recommendations as well. They can make those recommendations to the mayor and our budget team, so they can be put into our budget.
Yeah, how does this newly announced homeowners assistance fund relate to this?
The
$50 million. $500
which one? 50, half. Yeah, actually, I'm gonna let Drew speak to that. But that is for current homeowners who have experienced an impact because of COVID, to be able to catch up on mortgage payments. It also can be utilized by homeowners associations, just as I'm saying as an umbrella, for them to help stabilize their buildings as well, or their properties as well. Condo fees, taxes. So that's what that fund is allows us to do. So that fund, and Drew, jump in anywhere here. That fund actually is drawn down from the federal government, and it was similar to what we saw for rental assistance. So rental assistance, we had state DC, we utilized all that funding, and now through a process going through the federal government, we're actually going to draw down the $50 million for homeowner assistance, and that could be again for homeowners individually or the collective of like association for that person.
So they're set aside for residents.
So income requirements.
And we'll get into the details of
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
since we have more to talk about this
Yeah.
morning, but we will absolutely get all the details started.
That was, you ever see in cartoons when they put the outside? That's it. But keep that question, because that's a good one. This is what we also, and I don't know if this is today, but we'll talk about the current tools that we have. I think that's today's session. So we'll talk about the current tools that we have in order to actually go through, like you said, so you know kind of the array of what is available.
Okay.
There's that hook. But Reverend Adler, Director Kozart, thank you for leading. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm going to be sort of popping and out of sessions all the time. While we're meeting, I want to hear what you're saying. I know Mayor Bowser can't wait to be with you all again. And I know she's looking forward to the recommendations. And the final thing that I will say is that you have a hard job ahead of you, but you also have a deadline. So making sure that we get the work done in order to get those recommendations to the mayor end of September, beginning of October. Let's just say end of September. because it'll take us a little bit of time to learn. Let's make sure we do that. And the reason why we're pushing you all to work with that timeframe is that budget process. And with that, I also thank Councilmember Bonds for being here. The mayor likes to say she is the at-large council member for housing. So we're putting that to the test by her being part of the strike force. So thank you all for the work that you're going to do. Thanks for being here today, and look forward to being with you again over the summer.
Okay, so we're running a little behind, but we're going to catch up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Vanessa Perry. We have, in this process, decided to partner with some key stakeholder groups. And so the Urban Institute is one of those partners who's going to help us with the research and the data that we need to ensure that we're making informed decisions moving forward. Vanessa Gale Perry is a professor and associate dean for faculty and research at the George Washington University School of Business. And her research is focused on consumers in housing and financial markets, marketplace discrimination, and public policy interventions. And so if you can just join me in welcoming her, she's going to walk us through some of the data.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I am here and delighted to be here representing the Housing Finance Policy Center of the Urban Institute. That said, I'm also representing myself. My comments, any opinions that I make are not necessarily reflective of the Urban Institute or the Housing Finance Policy Center. But again, I'm delighted to be here. For that reason, and because coming to Howard is coming home, I was a student here. I also graduated from the great Banneker Senior Academic High School when it was diagonally across the street. So I remember coming here in the 80s on the bus every day. And so it's just really delightful to be here. And my first time in this beautiful building. So my goal is to pick up on some of the themes that came across in that video that we saw, which was just exceptionally well done, and set the stage by talking about sort of where we are. And I only have a few minutes to do so. So I could talk about this forever. Actually, I've been doing this for 25 years. So pardon me if I go into too much detail. I also am a professor, so I only know how to talk in increments of an hour and 15 minutes. So if I go over, just grab your backpack and bolt for the door, and I kind of know what that means. So Black households make up 41% of the population of households in DC, but only 34% are homeowners, and that is compared to a home ownership rate in the DC area for white in DC for white homeowners, which is closer to 50%. And the Black homeownership rate nationally is 43%, which is, odd considering that the incomes for Black households in DC are higher than they are anywhere else in the United States, not reflected in the home ownership rate. Something's missing here. Since 2018, there's been a decline in the number of Black homeowners. There's been a shift. The actual number's missing. I don't know why, but trust me when I tell you it's been considerable. Yet house prices are, the median house price at the first quarter of 2021 was $766,000. Which is not affordable, not nearly affordable for a household with a median income, even 120% of median income in this area. These house prices rose over 13% in 1 year and continue to rise. At the same time, Over 13% of mortgage applications that were submitted by Black prospective homebuyers were rejected. And that was in the DC area, compared to a citywide average of 5%. I'll talk more about that later. But the bottom line is Black households are less likely to be homeowners, face challenges in being able to qualify for mortgage credit to buy homes. And once they do buy homes and own homes, they actually receive fewer returns to homeownership because they pay more for homeownership and actually earn fewer gains to homeownership. I'll talk a bit about that. Why are we in this situation? Why are these circumstances the case? Well, a lot of that was covered in the video. So in summary, this really has to do with a legacy of systemic racism, of redlining, of segregation, and the cumulative disadvantage that these have created, which affect both the values of homes and characteristics of neighborhoods. They also affect access to opportunity, which then feeds into opportunities in labor markets and education markets, et cetera. And those feed into being able to qualify for mortgage credit and move into home ownership. So when you look at this diagram, focus on the elbows and the arrows. And they're intended to show sort of the complexity of the ecosystem of home ownership and housing finance and how they have responded in the context of the systemic racism and redlining that we talked about. So that video did an awesome job of laying out sort of the history of redlining, the role of the federal government and local jurisdictions, including things like restrictive covenants. And so if you look at the map, which is on the left, this is a map of the DC metropolitan area. The darker areas happen to be the areas in this map is very old. It's actually not that old. But this is a map that shows this darker areas are the areas that were predominantly white and carried the highest grades, so that lenders were much more willing to provide credit in those areas. These are not the exact homeowners loan corporation maps, because those for DC have actually been lost. But this is sort of a close approximation. And then what you'll notice here, if you sort of overlay this map shows where areas were lending to Black households was either restricted by the local neighborhood association or restricted by the deed to the house. And so those are the burgundy and the blue areas. And so if you overlay that, you start to see the relationship between these restrictions and the patterns of racial segregation that persist in DC today. Today, even despite the many changes and gentrification that have occurred over the last 20 years, the concentration of white households and white neighborhoods tends to still be to the west of Rock Creek Park and those areas, and the concentration of Black households and Black neighborhoods still tend to be largely to the east and southern areas of the city. So despite the prohibitions that came with the Fair Housing Act 1968, DC still remains one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And the effects of those policies we still see today. Let me say something about the flow of mortgage credit. So as I mentioned, just last year, Black prospective home buyers that applied for mortgages in 2021, the DC area, 13% were denied. And that is compared to about 2.4% of white applicants for mortgages in DC. They actually were denied for different reasons. This is the case sort of across the board. Actually, this is not DC in particular. This is across the US, I believe, but no reason to believe that there's anything significantly different. The most common denial reason for Black applicants is the debt to income ratio. Why is that? Well, Black people, because of participation in labor markets and educational disparities, have lower incomes typically across the board and higher levels of debts. Why is that? Largely because of the lack of intergenerational transfers that were talked about in the video that we saw. And so debt to income ratios are a large reason why mortgage loan applications get denied. So 43% tends to be the cutoff, which means, debts that are above 43% of your income tend to be considered higher risk. In recent years, thanks to advances in sort of the technology of mortgage underwriting, lenders are more likely to go up to 50%, but only in cases when sort of other factors in the mortgage application are, if not perfect, very close to perfect. So this is a problem for Black borrowers. White borrowers are more likely to be rejected for problems that have to do with the collateral, that is the property itself. And so in a market that's hot like this one, the most common issue is the contract price. The price that's offered for the house is actually higher than the appraised value. And as a result of that, lenders don't like it because it's harder for them to get a handle on the real risk of the loan. And so they reject them. But again, this only is happening in 2% of cases. I mentioned that Black people tend to pay more for home ownership, and this manifests itself a number of different ways. One, Black people tend to pay more interest. Why? Because they get charged higher interest rates, because Black people are more likely to, one, receive mortgages from FHA and VA, and they also tend to score less favorably on risk-related factors. So have to pay higher interest, have to pay more in mortgage insurance premiums, both from FHA, VA, and in the conventional market because of these additional risk factors. And what's interesting, because of the way property tax assessment works, it turns out that Black families, people concentrated in minority neighborhoods, have a tendency to pay higher property taxes as well. This amounts to over $13,000 over the life of a loan in an average sort of property, or $67,000 in lost retirement savings or home equity. So when we look at, that's what I was alluding to when I said the returns to home ownership are lower, because all of these extra costs are eating into the equity that gets accumulated over time, which translates into wealth. These numbers, by the way, were drawn from a study that was my Urban Institute colleague, former HUD colleague, published in 2020. So wealth accumulation has been limited for Black homeowners. If you look at this chart, you can see the significant disparities in median home values, $480,000 for Black households compared to $750,000 for white households. Similarly, we see significant disparities in housing wealth. That's actually, housing equity. This is in millions of dollars. So if you talk about, this is like $26 billion compared to $54 billion in total housing wealth for Black compared to white households. And then you see these gaps between white households and members of other groups. So taken together, we see that we have a lot of challenges to overcome, especially since we're really trying to compensate for things that happened many generations ago, and the effects persist today. Last, but certainly not least, one of the issues that we're going to have to address is the problem with the supply, the lack of supply of housing units. Both number of single family units produced has plummeted. They've been made up for just a tiny bit by a slight increase in multifamily units, but these are not interchangeable. The bottom line is that this really constrained supply means house prices are one of the reasons why house prices are so high and will continue to remain high as this continues to be the case. So the supply problem is something that even if we fix all of the other problems in our system, we're still going to have to address. So we've got lots of areas where we need to improve and that this initiative needs to focus on. One is closing the racial homeownership gap and reducing the sort of exit of Black homeowners from the DC area. We want to address the inequalities and inequities in access to mortgage credit. We want to focus on making sure that fair housing legislation is enforced both on the federal and local levels. And we need to start thinking about affordability and supply issues among others. So I will now stop talking and because I am prepared to listen to this really distinguished group of experts that have been brought here to deal with these problems. Thank you so much.
So we are going to transition. We're going to transition to our panel discussion. So I'm going to invite our panelists to come up. And while they do, I am going to introduce our moderator for this conversation, who is Interim Director Anita Cozart, who is the Director of the Office of Planning, and she's also one of the co-chairs of the Black Homeownership Strike Force. And so she will introduce the rest of the panelists, but excited for them to share with us their perspectives on some of the issues that have been discussed this morning. Is the end of her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. We get our panelists settled here today. We're going to spend a little bit of time reflecting on what we just saw and heard. And the panelists will introduce themselves that way. Again, I'm Anita Cozart, I'm the Interim Director of the Office of Planning here in the district, and delighted to be the co-chair along with Braylon Handler of the Black Homeownership Strike Force. And so for the next, I would say 50 minutes is my
Sure.
45 minutes.
Excellent.
We're going to spend a little bit of time again, like I said, reflecting on this, and we have experts on the panel who are going to introduce themselves and be able to share from their experience and their expertise, some reflections on kind of where we are today and where we need to go in terms of the goal that Mayor Bowser has asked us to set, and even more importantly, the outcomes that we want to see. So with that, I'm going to start with the initial question. I'm going to go down the line and ask that you share your name and your organizational affiliation and your response to reactions to both our excellent presentation from Dr. Gary, and also what confirmed what you already knew and have experienced, what surprised you, and what things. What did it confirm? What surprised you, and what questions does it leave you with? Please rise for our purpose.
Good morning, Drew Hubbard, Interim Director of the DC. Both the presentation confirmed, I think, what we know, historically, and just a larger task that we're confronted with, but we have to start somewhere. We're confronted that we're in the right place, have the right people, and direction. But we didn't believe about how actually championship.
This would be, Chris McDonald, CEO of the District of Columbia Health. I think for me, there was unfortunately nothing to do, right? And we've been talking internally about how we do something new. To respond to challenges. So I'm excited about the opportunity to work with folks who are up here on the panel. And to serve and engage to the American. I think we have to know to do it. Most important, I think we are Bowser that's created that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pam Carey, and I lead racial equity at like my panelists said, I live in this space. In this space, I'm a fair lending attorney prior to my program. And so there wasn't anything new. When I was thinking, we were asked to write down our emotion, however, even though I live in this space professionally and have for a very long time, in that video many times, the word that came to mind for me was anger. And it's really about how we harness that. I think those of us who are feeling the impacts of federal housing policy and all that has happened to keep Black people down, so to speak. I think anger is the appropriate feeling, but those of us with the tools and power and influence, I think now is our moment. The stars are aligned right now, and so I'm really excited to be part of others and to see what we can do to really my home.
Or speak it out and pass it, that would be better.
Good. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Becky Cole, and I serve as the head of diversity, equity, inclusion for corporate responsibility at JPMorgan Chase. Most recently, I sat in the foundation leading our strategic grant making in the region. And when the deputy mayor asked about what word came to mind, I was thinking about how intentional across sectors. It was the purpose and focus of ensuring that Black people were not ensured a pathway to ownership. And it just really called out what I should say before I get into this, that my opinions are my own and are not endorsed by JPMorgan Chase. It really called out that this work around Black homeownership is liberation work. That people who came to this country as property being denied the ability to own property is intentional, and it requires us to really think across sectors to ensure that we are moving forward with a really thoughtful liberation mindset.
And then the other questions that I had was really, as we always know, how does this continue to show up and manifest itself today? And particularly around appraisals and the conversations that a number of folks have had, such as Andre Ariad, working around appraisal bias and how even if there is ownership, that ownership continues to be devalued and diminished.
Put that here and I'll just speak up. Okay, all right. My name is Harrison Beecher. I serve as the 2022 president of the Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors. And also I'm a salesperson for the team that works in DC, Maryland, Virginia. We're trying to talk about over some of the best issues. Get to see this from a couple sides of helping realtors who are engaging with consumers that are trying to navigate this, but then also directly working with consumers, a lot of Black and brown consumers, trying to figure out ways to stay and ways to own. The biggest thing from Mr. Rossman's work, and also with institutes, like everybody in this panel, I've seen it engaged a lot. The concept of de jure versus de facto. I'm sorry, I'm not saying that wrong. We grow up and we come up thinking that things just happen. They just are the way they are. East of the river is what it is. Uptown is what it is. The other side of the park is what it is. But understanding that there were legislations, there were policies, there was intentionality behind what was done in the past to keep people of color away from opportunity is both frustrating from an emotional standpoint, but then tells me with what we're doing now, this is the other side of de jure in the positive direction, saying we're taking policy, we're taking funds, we're taking processes, all the P's that the Democratic director said earlier, to be intentional in the other direction, to give people access. The mortgage denial piece is something that I thought about a lot too, because navigating systems of money and wealth is a direct benefit privilege. So it's my hope that I can help bring some of the market understanding, seeing what's happening in the field and the truth of our market dynamics and what it costs to buy, sell, and invest in the region, but then help pair some of these other educational pieces and tools that folks just got de facto before, and turning it around to be more intentional and creating and putting them in the hands of folks that need the most, which are our Black folks in the city, opportunities.
So, Dr. T, I want to go to you first to kind of give us a little bit of a national perspective. So JP Morgan Chase has been working on these issues. So what can you tell us about what you've seen in terms of outcomes in cities as it relates to those three Ps, people, processes, and procedures? Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we have been working on these issues across the bank. So not just within the work that we do within corporate responsibility, but also through our home lending team. And in terms of specifically around the people, this work is exciting and it's forward thinking, and it will definitely shed a light across the country on how we move forward around supporting Black homeownership. Earlier this year, we worked with a number of our partners in Seattle to identify strategies around Black homeownership and provided an over $1 million grant to do quite similar work in standing up for thinking and funding and use around it. So the people piece is that we're very clear that Black homeownership is critical, and we really need to be intentional in identifying pathways for that population. And so in 2020, I believe, we utilized a program that is known as the Special Purpose Credit Program that allows for Black census tracts, certain census tracts, for us to be intentional around our lending. And so through the Special Credit Program, we have additional down payment assistance or closing costs that specifically target Black census tracts for homeownership. And so I think that's one of the key pathways. Additionally, what was the last one? Procedure? Yeah. Procedure, policies. Oh, okay. This might kind of fit in a number of them, but you know, I mentioned this question around appraisals, and I'm looking over at Wendy, who way back when I was working in Detroit from there, we were talking about this issue about appraisals as well. And this question around for your house to appraise at a value that allows it to capture the equity value. And that process of appraisal and who does it, where it's done, you know, we were tackling remote appraisals with folks who were unfamiliar with neighborhoods, or that, you know, did not represent the community in a way that really diminished values, and we're seeing it continue on, particularly last year. A number of folks were unable to refinance their property and get the cash out in terms of their equity, and that largely had to do with a failed appraisal process. So as part of our work, we're also really being intentional about working with the appraisers that serve our home lending and underwriting, and doing intentional training for those appraisers to ensure that they are mindful of their own individual clients as they evaluate property.
Thank you. Staying kind of at the national level, and just a reminder for those who are listening, you can share, make sure you have your questions and feel free to share those in the chat. We'll be sharing those as we kind of move through the panel. So to keep up that national perspective, Pam, FHFA recently announced the equitable housing finance plans, and just last week. And so wondering if you could share kind of the origin story around those and what we might be able to expect both at a national level and then even bridge into a local level.
Sure, happy to do so. So just as a level set, because I don't know the familiarity of everybody in the room with the role we play, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, we're government sponsored. We're in conservatorship of the federal government right now. We were given a mandate by the federal government to develop 3-year strategic plans for advancing equity in homeownership. As I mentioned in the intro, I have the privilege to lead that effort on behalf of Freddie Mac. So it's been a journey of, prior to that, I was in Freddie Mac as fair lending lead for a decade. This has been very interesting to move to the business side and to serve in the strategic world. And I was actually hired into this position prior to the government asking us. I already had the mandate of addressing the Black homeownership gap for Freddie Mac, and I spent the better part of last year doing building a team within the company, but really doing a lot of research, not necessarily of the academic type of research, but really connecting with researchers like Dr. Perry, both who are economists. We did a lot of our own analytical research. We also did a tremendous amount of qualitative research. And really what we were trying to be very intentional about was speaking with prospective Black homeowners, current Black homeowners, former Black homeowners, folks who lost their homes in the economic crisis or for other reasons, and really trying to flesh out the various personas. There is no monolithic Black person and no monolithic Black family, but really making sure that we teased out all of the stress points, all the barriers, so that we are designing solutions that address those barriers. And you know, this is a personal passion of mine, and although I spend a lot of time in this space, I don't want to lead an effort that is not reflective of the experiences of people in their communities. And a lot of you have touch points and perspectives that are very valuable. We spent a lot of time also talking to industry groups. And I say that in the past tense because that's what influenced the plan. And if you read the introduction to our plan, which we just made public we finalized them at the end of the year, but they were just made public by FHA and each of the GSEs in the last couple of weeks. And we've laid out a variety of solutions and commitments to addressing Black homeownership. I want to put one other caveat out there. When I started in this position a year and a half ago, my mandate was just to address the Black homeownership, the Black-white homeownership gap. Over the course of this work, we pivoted to including addressing Latino homeownership. Latinos also have a very significant homeownership gap and will, in relatively short order, be the largest single group of first-time home buyers. And so it really is the combination of addressing Black and Latino homeownership really represents not only a kind of moral imperative to address the inequality and the where we are today as a result of such intentional actions, but it really is a business imperative as well. And that is really part of why I think the stars are finally aligning for this work to take place and for us to make some progress in addressing the Black homeownership gap, because it's no longer if we in the financial services industry can't figure out how to better serve a more diverse population of home buyers, it really will hurt our bottom line, which is always what, frankly, it takes to get people moving in the private sector when the interests are aligned. I personally feel a deep sense of urgency because I think while the stars are aligned inside Washington and outside of Washington, I know that how these things go, the pendulum could swing in the other direction, and for that reason, I think we all need to really double down and move as quickly as we can to set in place some changes to policy and processes that are durable. And one of those is really the use of, as my fellow panelists just talked about, special purpose credit programs. So special purpose credit programs permit creditors to offer credit on terms more favorable to protected classes, including Black families, as long as there's a demonstrated social need. I think we all know that it's not very difficult to show a demonstrated social need for Black families. Looking at denial rates, looking at the wealth disparities, and the fact that most Black families don't have sufficient resources to get into first-time home ownership. And so really it is wealth that is the largest barrier. And so there are things that we can do and things that we must do. And as Freddie Mac, we are the secondary market. We set the underwriting guidelines that lenders use to underwrite mortgages. And so we have an opportunity to both change some of those guidelines to make it easier for Black families to qualify for loans. We also have this opportunity of, as I was referring to, special purpose credit program, to have an opportunity to intentionally have different standards, either in terms of the down payment that is required to get into a home, to have different requirements around closing costs, different requirements around mortgage insurance, and we are creating our own special purpose credit program that will enable lenders to originate on terms more favorable for Black families and for folks who live in majority, minority census tracts. One issue that is of particular, I will extend credit to Chase. They have for a long time piloted and various types of special purpose credit programs. Special purpose credit programs have been around for 50 years, but the legal authority for them, but they have not been used. The federal financial regulatory agencies had shown the fact, so to speak, on the use of special purpose credit programs until quite recently. Now, all of the federal financial regulators have come out and encourage the lending sector to embrace the promise of special purpose credit programs. And we, in the market, Fannie and Freddie, are developing special purpose credit programs to make it easier for lenders to originate more favorable terms for Blacks and others under our special purpose credit program. We also will be purchasing loans originated under lenders' special purpose credit program. And so this is really stage 2. We're hoping to have more that we can announce in the not too distant future about what the special purpose credit programs will entail. And directly being designed to tackle the challenges that we are talking about here today. But we're just one market participant, a very large market participant in, and we have the luxury of sitting on a treasure trove of data that others need to justify the existence of special purpose credit and to really more appropriately assess risk and in new and different ways. And we take very seriously the responsibility as the keepers of that data. So, for example, to refer to appraisal bias, well, we have all of the appraisal data for any home that was a loan, any home that was appraised that an application for a loan that was ultimately purchased by either Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, we have all of the appraisals. We've done a lot of analysis that has borne out with what we all suspected, that bias doesn't happen in the appraisal industry. And it is pervasive. It's not in certain regions. It is pervasive in everything. It is very extensive. And one of the problems, of course, is the makeup of the research themselves. The appraisal industry is predominantly white male. It is going to take a generation to diversify the appraisers themselves, but we are working in partnership with the appraisal industry to diversify the appraisers, but we're also working to hopefully increase the use of automated valuation models but bearing in mind that even those models reflect the bias that we think into the system. But at least it removes at the point of sale, at least it removes some of the personal bias that can occur. The systemic bias is it's baked in. And so it is a challenge that we are trying to address with the industry. And so more to come on that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry.
You've given us a
Going
lot.
on too long.
You've given us a lot in terms of both policy and procedure, so thank you for that. I want you to help us zoom into the DC context and really help us think about what are the pain points that the Black households that you've been working with over the past several years, what are they experiencing that we really need to keep in mind as we move forward?
So some specific data that I ran last night from our most holistic service about the different housing types and what they cost in the city is probably the biggest pain point of how much does it cost for a family home in the city. Specifically, we talk about a single family detached home, that median price year to date is actually 1.22 million, average is 1.54. For a single family attached, so not detached, the median is 900K, the average of 1.09. For condominiums, median is 540,000, average 614, and for cooperatives, that's 353,000, median average of 432. So at the top, we talk about the income level, the average income to afford that single family product, even in the middle of the market, that is really challenging. The qualifying from both a payment standpoint, a cash upfront standpoint, and a credit standpoint to buy that home is a pain point. When we work with the city programs, which my team does personally a lot, we're engaging from an association standpoint to improve the working with all the city programs that can help. One challenge is the performance of programs that can make the financial barriers a little easier. When people are competing against somebody that has a very large down payment, using regular conventional financing, and then can perform at the speed of the market. So if we talk about the major challenges, first, access to the capital, the wealth, and I think of a conversation about wealth as synonymous and side by side with privilege, right? And we talk about that de jure versus de facto, generations of privilege and wealth that have empowered non-Black DC buyers or folks, transplants coming from around the world, around the country to buy here. They have a separate set of rules, backing, funds, resources, knowledge on how to navigate mortgage applications, knowledge on how to navigate appraisal shortfalls. From a personal standpoint, one of my biggest conversation points with clients in the past year was helping reframe their understanding of risk. If I had someone that's a younger millennial looking to get into the market and saw their parents lose everything in 2006, 7, and 8, and I tell them that in order to buy this home in a neighborhood in Northeast or Southeast or anywhere in the city that has a lot of reasons empirically why the value should sustain or go up, to get it right now, you're going to have to pay over appraised price, period. Like it's nothing I dance around. And for my team being able to explain that to them and give them context that the market has not caught up to both the demand, the incomes, and this lack of supply. In order to secure this now, we will have to pay over appraised price. If it's somebody utilizing a program, paying over appraised price is not an option, period. So who does that leave that can actually compete and do it is folks with additional cash resources, additional options in terms of qualifications to make their debt to income ratio look different, borrow more. It really is about navigating and creating systems that allow people to compete at even a closer level to where the rest of the market is actually moving. And then the other piece that we want to help folks overcome is the different practitioners they work with in the process, being able to better explain and help them navigate the different kinds of risks. So as realtors, it's making sure that we, as an association, as individual practitioners, know how all the programs work and get past anecdotes or fear that a NACA or an HPAC or the DC Open Doors or something is different, harder, bad, right? Just anecdotally, and say, here's exactly how these programs work. Here's why we should be, as practitioners, informed about them, knowledgeable about them, to not just explain to buyers, but to explain to our seller clients. Because you got to think, we're the conduits that explain to sellers which offer they should take. So that's something I'm really passionate about my leadership this year, is to elevate and get past just anecdotes, general fear, and get to details and understanding of how they work. But then even bigger, say, outside of what you should do to be a good person and a good citizen in your city, this is something that's a great business opportunity to be able to serve a wider swath of very hungry, very able home buyers who want to do this, but have had systemic things that prevented them from being able to compete on the same level.
Thank you, Harrison, and you did a great job of really painting a picture for us of what's happening in DC, but then also pointing out people and procedures. Those pieces make very important. So Drew, I want to go to you and talk about kind of what are the things that keep you up at night from where you sit as it relates to people, procedures and policy.
It's kind of right. The budget around both HVAC and EHAB has gone up over the past couple of years. So what that means is that those 350, we run out of money. So, we are getting those out the door, but there are those people, if you run into those areas, move as quickly, you know. That's what we're teaching out. Director here, Christelle, May is one of the measures of along with Greater Washington. But how can we prepare that and make it any go away? Move more quickly.
That takes us to Christelle. So can you talk a little bit about kind of concerns you have for this work from a financing perspective, and maybe point us to some ideas that maybe you think you picked up that you have and what you've heard this morning.
So first of all, I carry a statement of me. Yeah. Let me start with an anecdote. As I sat here and I listened and talked about appraisal. So my wife and I bought a house back in September of last year, and it was near the median home price in the district of $670,000, right? And so then 3 months later, the neighbor bought a house right next door, and they paid $880,000 for it. And Rev, I said, I am blessed and highly favored. So I'm loving it. We are actually we're in the process of kind of renovating the house again with another appraisal. And so the house was appraised. And I said, I paid $670 for it. The appraisal came back at $650. I was like, I'm confused. So something is a mess, right? And I was a little befuddled because I was like, the house right next door, right, sold for this. I think I'm relatively educated, right? I live in Petworth, which is one of the most booming areas in the District of Columbia, right? And there's a disconnect. So Harrison, I had to get off in the last, pull all the counts and send them to the appraiser and say, bro, that's not really working, right? But everybody can't do that. And so when we talk about appraisal, that's a very real thing for Black folks, right? And so let me pivot back. I oftentimes, when I talk about the work we do, I like to contextualize it first, right? So the District of Columbia is 68.3 square miles. And of that 68.3 square miles, 18 of them belong to the federal government. Another 8 are waterways. Another 2 are owned by the Department of Parks and Recs, the District of Columbia. And the final mile, that square mile, is owned by the National Lottery. And when you do the math, you see that over 42% of the land in the district can't be used. That's where we're starting from, right? And so then when you dig down into the type of housing that we've been talking about on this panel, single family housing occupies the most units, right? But houses the least people. And it also costs the most. So this is where we're starting when we talk about the pressure of home ownership for those in the District of Columbia, right? And so part of what we've been trying to figure out is, well, who are our buyers, right? And we created this profile, and it's what we love to call the story of Taylor, right? So Taylor is a single young Black woman. She's 33 years old. She makes about $8,000 a year. She has 2 kids, and she has a credit score of 711, right? So Taylor, bad and Bruce, right? She is ready to go. And so the question becomes for us, how do we find more Taylors? Where is she? And so I stayed up all last night there looking at MLS, right? And so we talk about these numbers. Every year, about 10,000 homes are sold in the District of Columbia, right? We talk about where those median prices are. They're exceptionally high. And so I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. So let me take another cut. Let me see what happens when I look at home prices of $500,000 less. And when I took that next cut, I went down a level deeper. What I found is almost 40% of the homes that are sold in the District of Columbia are less than $500,000. So now I'm asking the question, what am I missing? I came in and asked, I was like, that's Harrison, I was like, did I misread something? Right? And so there is supply out there, and the question becomes, who's getting to that supply and how? Right? So when we're talking about this, we've got to prepare our people. So it's something that I like to call supply and finance, right? It's not just about finding the supply, because it's clearly out there, right? When we work with Harvey and our HIP program, Harvey's producing, 10 to 20 units a year, beautiful units, right? With a high level of quality, and people are actually buying into it, and they're getting $100,000 to $200,000 worth of equity, right? That's one place that we find supply. But interestingly enough, we've talked about this epidemic across the country, where you have investors coming in and buying up single family homes, right? And so when I heard of that, I was like, oh no, we're cool in the district, we don't have enough land. And then the Washington Post said, pump your brakes, right? When you start looking at areas of the district east of the river, particularly places like Greenwood, a third of the properties that sold last year were sold to investors. So these places that were naturally affordable, these legacy homes that could have been passed along, are now being scooped up. So you've got more pressure, right? So where are we sending people, and how are we equipping Black people to be competitive in this market? Because at the end of the day, everybody on this panel said, we come with something, right? Whether it's the appraisal, whether it's the lack of cash to put down, right? Whether it may sometimes be the credit score. When we look at Taylor, we see Taylor incubate in some instances, right? So she'll find one of those lenders who understands all of the different programs, and they'll stick with it, right? And so over 6 months to a year, she'll push that credit score, match that, right? So when you ask me, what are we going to do? We're going to continue to work with Drew on HPAP. What we're looking at is how do we refine DC open doors, right? Because I was walking around here, I thought I was bad. And so we had our first meeting, and it was like, yeah, not just HVAC, but DC open doors too, right? Like, we all have some work to do. So how are we going to refine those programs and expand out to the calling market? That's
Sure. Shout out to the city about programs that are aligned with this work that are already underway that speak to what can I just call it, Chris? Okay. I was really nervous to make sure I didn't get your title wrong. The district has been really intentional about heirs property and ensuring that folks are really thinking through about their legacy and passing down properties to family members, which is critical if you're thinking about investors. And also financial health, particularly in this environment of high inflation, that income is starting to look very different. And so when you talked about supply and finance, particularly individual finance, how critical that is as well. So I just want to call that out. In addition to this work, there are other work streams that are critically important.
Thank you for lifting those up. I think at this point we want to go to questions, and our wonderful folks at JSA are going to assist us in making sure that we hear questions that are coming from those who are listening.
First, thank you so much. Our first question comes from Michelle Parks Robinson, and she asks, this program provides seed money that will, what will the lenders and similar institutions being offered Black homeowners to help build wealth while maintaining home ownership and beyond? Of course, I'm so sorry. This program provides seed money. What will the lenders and similar institutions being offered what will they offer Black homeowners to help build wealth while maintaining home ownership and beyond? The references to the 10 million.
Sure. So let me just clarify the 10 million, and then I will look at the panel and see if anyone wants to have early comments as it relates to that. So the $10 million will be available starting October 1 of 2022. And the work of the Black Homeownership Strike Force, of which several of us are members, is to make recommendations to Mayor Bowser about how that is used. It may be that we use some of those resources to think about issues related to financing. It may be related to people, policy, and procedures. That's yet to come. So if you've got ideas as it relates to that, please go to blackhomedc.gov so that you can share with us some of your ideas as it relates to that. And then I'll turn to the panel and see if anyone wants to opine on that.
One of the conversation points I'd like to lead on and get together is looking at the distribution of funds to both dig into people's pockets to help them purchase, which is happening at a high level. The gentleman talking about that, but then taking a deeper dive into financial literacy, the understanding of how to navigate the rules of money. So, one of the things I'm talking about, proposing to everybody, and we're not speaking on everything that they'll have, but I hear is kind of deeper legacy initiatives to dive into navigating financial risk, understanding credit, understanding things in a different, more detailed way for those incubating buyers and for folks who want to get into the market long term. But I argue that a portion of the funds is great to be invested in some different ways to educate, prepare folks to be in the market.
Thank you for that.
A little bit about the missing middle. I did mention this earlier, and it's certainly something that we are struggling with, right? And it goes back to Taylor. Taylor has a great job, but she's been helping her mother, right? She's been paying off other debts. She does not have the wealth in order to be able to buy that home. So we talk about what we can do. We have to have tough conversations about how we're going to meet those people in the middle. Because they're ready, they're able, but they don't have the resources, right? They don't make enough. They don't make too little to qualify for some of the programs. And with the prices of homes, they need some real help.
Thank you. Let's take another question. Of course. Our second question comes from Andrew James. This actually goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Mr. Teacher. She says, hi, it seems like a real estate equity firms / real estate developers of luxury units are purchasing homes in cash, which would be ideal for first-time buyers in the state. For instance, a real estate developer purchasing an existing home for $450,000 in cash. This action cancels out first-time home buyers. Questions: is there a policy or future policies on restricting luxury developers from squeezing out first-time buyers? Further, how can first-time buyers in the district be considered a strong candidate in this seller's market? Thank you for your guidance.
Sure. In terms of policies that would restrict the free market transaction, I can't speak to that. Won't tackle it. I will say we have helped some buyer clients actually went out and beat while cash is king. It is not always king. Period. So this is back to that conversation of privilege, access to systems, relationships, and understanding. With the right team assembled, with the right structure, with the right understanding, the right ability to compete at close to market standards, I think that can improve folks that are using financing ability to be able to purchase that same home. Quite often, a cash buyer will not be paying a price premium. So if you do the math, what is that number that somebody utilizing financing would have to pay that still works for them, that could allow them to purchase it, that could also work for the seller? So there's layers of both education and preparation that can help support it, but the cash buyers and what they do in the market right now, on the other side, in terms of creating supply to meet the upper bracket demand, one of the stats I've looked up of the homes that transacted so far this year, there were still plus 2 million homes. In 2022, homes over $1 million, there were still 1180 of those that sold in the city, but there were 1,281 sold under 400,000. When someone's coming in to create a product that supplies the upper bracket, that can also reduce demand when somebody going down to buy the cheaper one. So supply improvement is important. There's different spaces and strategies to address both sides of things.
So, and I'll just add before we go to the next question, one of the things, just picking up on something Decade mentioned, was this idea of even going farther upstream before it even goes on the market, such that an investor could buy. Are there some interventions that could be provided to the homeowner such that they might be able to keep it, to pass it on to someone in their family, that kind of thing? So that's another set of strategies that we can think about. It's a little bit more upstream. So I want to see if there's any questions in the room, and I would ask you, if you don't mind, to come up and use the microphone just to make sure. Oh, there is a microphone right here. And just please use the microphone to ask any of your questions. Yes, I see a question here.
You keep saying $80,000. Oh, some people are making less than that, 50,000 maybe. You know, that really needs to be considered, you know, the lower people, that's who we want to put on housing for. And, also, what about public land? Can we use public land? Some of the support of our housing?
So, I think, part of that is, and that's like part of this point, you know, our programs actually are. We have, mortgage loans and really systems for low and moderate income. Another piece I did not mention on the first photo too, with Councilman Bond's help, starting in October, the amount of assistance is going to increase $8,000 up to $202,000 for eligible folks looking to be first-time home buyers. But I think part of what we are tasked with is to look at the whole spectrum, affordable through workforce and beyond, particularly around Black homeownership. We want to make sure we have stopping points all along the spectrum, so we have product and points of access to help all along, not just for folks at the affordable level, but the workforce and beyond also. And more about public land, we partner with HFA on our HIP program where we do acquire some vacant like properties to put it back in production. And typically it's around the town of the commercial.
So we have a program, the housing investment program, and it was created to do a couple of things. Number one, it was created to address that missing middle. Right? So people who leave the district who have been here for a long time, who couldn't afford to stay, how can we capture them? Right? So that's number one. Number two, it's created to develop out, right? Develop for people who are living in those homes. And then finally, we partner with emerging developers, right? So that they could then build their capacity, do more, and at a certain point, step up and go to the next level. I do want to touch on your question, I think it's an important question, and we have this conversation about resources and resources. You reference Taylor and that's point. It's the prototype of the program, right? Not that she's the only person to serve. So let me be clear, right? When I work with him, we're going up and down, right? But the question becomes, and this is the thing that we were talking about with Harrison, is as we prepare folks on the spectrum, can they meet the market where the market is, right? And so the work that the mayor did in her budget and that the council member helped move forward is really important. That $200,000 is going to be super important, right? But as we get out there, we got to look at all the pieces, right? So what happens when we get folks in the homes and there's a whole group, right? Or in the middle of winter, the furnace breaks down, right? Like that's real, right? And the council member and I have had that conversation in the middle of the night where I pull up my pen and paper and she's like, Christopher, it's your job to figure this out. There you go.
That's good.
So
just so make sure folks online heard, 25,000 is available to first-time home buyers starting October 1. Thank you, Councilmember Bonds.
So is it newly ones or can some of the old ones add to? Going forward, of course, we have to go forward, so we will be going forward. Mr. Hubbard can tell you about the single family rehab program that we have at DHCD, which can go up to 75,000, I think, still, for those kinds of repairs, for those who didn't get in on this October 1, 2022 measure.
Yours. Again, that's kind of the other perspective we talked about, some of the legacy programs. The single family rehab program really is in place to make sure folks who are long time on life, maybe accessibility issues dealt with, and that's kind of, again, making sure we have tools all along that work.
So is that for condos too?
So single family, for we have a small building program for all.
So we're gonna, one last question. Oh, okay, we're gonna take these two first, this question, and then, Reverend Hagley's gonna share his question, and then we'll go across the panel for a last comment.
Good afternoon. My question is in regards to the programs such as HPAC and DC Open Doors. Just curious as to how many of those applicants or those users of those programs are non-minorities, just in terms of, you know, you have a lot of folks that are coming, non-minorities that are coming to the city as transplants or graduate students that are here that meet those lower income kind of medians that are eligible for the programs, but you don't see as many kind of like people of color utilizing them. You may see more non-people of color utilizing them. I'm just curious what that ratio is or that percentage.
So before the panel comments on it, we're going to take Reverend Hagley's question as well, and then have the panel comment on it.
It came to my brother, Don, in terms of, we got to be willing to do something and curtail the speculation that's taking place. Because that's what's driving up the cost. When I bought my house on Cambridge Street, I stepped in the middle of something that I didn't even know I stepped in the middle of, which was an appraiser telling the bank that foreclosed on the property, what the property was worth, so that they could sell it to a dummy company that they set up and flip it. And I stepped into the middle of that. And the reason I found out I stepped in the middle of that is because all of a sudden I get a call from the bank offering me $10,000 to let them out of the deal. And because the bank realized that what they had operated on was an under-assessment, so that a strong corporation that the appraiser was part of could purchase the property. That's not good. So what's going on? You see these investors with limitless supply of money that comes in from out of state that basically step in and buy up their property. And when it comes out, on the other side, it's unaffordable. And when we look at the flipping that takes place, most of it's inadequate. Doesn't warrant the price, it's just shiny, it looks like a little shiny nickel, but that's all it's worth, isn't it? So unless we're willing to do something that curtails that kind of speculation in the District of Columbia, the prices will continue to go up.
So, did you want to offer a question for the panel, or
that's a question in itself.
Okay, okay. So I'll help to. So for all our panelists, feel free to opine on kind of understanding about how who's using the programs that we've talked about, and then also formulate this around kind of, so what could we do as it related to their property and that transition.
I can pull the particular numbers around each step, but overall, you can see it is too black and white. We have a little different than the definition of employee for that. Each have itself, we see the demographics.
So for us, we're in the middle of transitioning to a new center. But I can tell you that 67% of our borrowers are and we continue and finding that those are good. Just given the programs that we have, but it's fascinating to me. That's typically, and we know that more Black women are getting mortgages and buying houses than Black men.
Okay, well, I thank you.
So I appreciate the question about the demographics of the individuals using the programs. We've certainly seen with looking at data from the HUD's Housing Choice Voucher Program. Housing Choice vouchers are very often used by predominantly minorities for rentals, but housing choice vouchers can also be used for home purchase, and the demographics are quite different for the use of those funds. They are being used by very few minorities for the purchase of homes. And so we're looking at ways that we can make it easier to use housing choice voucher funds. And those are federal government HUD funds, to use, it is funded by HUD, but then through, state HFAs, to make it easier to use those funds, to qualify for a mortgage and looking how we underwrite, the availability of those funds. The other thing that I'm very focused on is as the lending community is looking at standing up what the special purpose credit programs we referred to, and we're making benefits available to residents of minority census tracts. Many of those residents, many of those subsidy dollars going into the census tract will not be utilized by the minority families that we are intending to help. So we have to be very careful about the way in which we execute those programs, those lending programs, so that we don't accelerate gentrification. But we are trying to be very purposeful in making our programs available to, on the basis of the race and ethnicity of the borrower, in addition to making the benefits available to residents of these census tracts. It might be quite possible that there could be families who already, Black families who already moved out of the city because they were priced out of ownership, and they had an interest in purchasing a home back in the city if they had the ability to afford to do so. That is closer to their defined community. So we're just looking at it from a lot of different perspectives, but I hope that the strike force does keep front of mind how we go about this work in a way that doesn't accelerate gentrification and benefiting those who are not intended to do that.
I think well said. I'm just super excited about this work and definitely think about your private sector partners and how we can show up.
Most excited about the opportunity to further empower Black DC to navigate risk, both on the mortgage application side, the front side of being evaluated for the risk to be lent money, but then also navigating risk from a purchase side, knowing some of the things of privilege and wealth and other soft skills that we're taught to regulate and folks on it. And there's an opportunity for us to share some of that with Black DC and hopefully enable them to better compete with market rent and to be able to get some of this product that is so strong. So I'm excited, I'm encouraged, very happy to be able to.
Well, let's thank our panel.
With that, we're going to conclude our morning session and say thank you to all of you who are here, also to those who have chimed in on channel 16 or through our Zoom link that we have provided. So with that, we will end the session. Okay, so now that the TV is off, I'm going